My name is Selena Belinda, and I am 28 years old. 6 months ago at my father's 60th birthday gala, he stood in front of 150 elite guests and told them I was a failure. He raised a glass of vintage champagne and publicly predicted my bakery would be bankrupt within a year. He called my dream a foolish little muffin shop, while praising my brother Julian for closing his latest corporate merger. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just raised my own glass, walked out of the ballroom, and decided I was done being his disappointment. Then yesterday, my father lost his biggest investor. He came begging to the door of my shop, desperate for a bailout to save his entire firm. He did not know that the new landlord holding the deed to his office building was me. Before I tell you how a girl with a whisk bought out a Wall Street banker, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. Let me know your age, your location, and the local time in the comments below. I love seeing where my listeners are tuning in from. Now let me take you back to a crisp evening last November at the Fairfield Country Club. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. My stepmother, Victoria, was holding court near the ice sculpture, wearing a custom Prada dress that cost more than my commercial oven. I stood near the back by the service doors in a $60 dress I bought off the rack. If you looked closely, you could still see a faint smudge of flour on my left wrist, a stubborn reminder of the 14-hour shift I had just pulled to prep my dough for the next morning. My father, Harrison, tapped his knife against his crystal flute. The room went silent. He was a man who commanded attention, a senior partner at a prestigious investment firm. He spent the first 10 minutes of his speech talking about legacy. He put his hand on Julianne's shoulder and told the crowd how proud he was of his son, the junior partner, the heir to the empire. The applause was deafening. Then my father let his gaze drift across the room until it landed on me. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by that familiar, calculating chill. "And then there is my daughter Selena," he said into the microphone. A few people turned to look at me. She decided to reject the corporate world to open a foolish little muffin shop in Brooklyn. He paused, waiting for the chuckles to ripple through the crowd of executives. "It is a cute hobby, but I give it a year before she runs out of capital and comes asking for her old desk back." 150 wealthy socialites laughed. My brother smirked. Victoria took a delicate sip of her wine, hiding a smile behind the rim of her glass. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to flush with embarrassment or run out in tears, proving I was exactly as fragile as they claimed. I stood my ground. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter tray. I caught my father's eye across the grand ballroom, raised my glass in a silent toast, and turned toward the exit. The sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the sudden quiet of the room. I walked out into the freezing night air. I did not feel humiliated. I felt clarity. The family I spent my whole life trying to please had just set me free. They thought my silence was defeat. They had no idea it was a business strategy. My father loved to tell his country club peers that I was a financial liability. He painted a portrait of a lost millennial surviving on his reluctant charity. That was his favorite fiction. The truth was a narrative he never saw coming. When my mother passed away a decade ago, she did not leave her personal assets to my father. She knew exactly the kind of man she married, a man who measured affection in profit margins and viewed his children as portfolio investments to be managed. Instead, she established a private trust, a modest ironclad life insurance policy worth $150,000. The legal stipulations were watertight. My father could not touch a single cent. The money was mine to claim the moment I turned 25. When the funds cleared into my personal account, my father summoned me to his oak-paneled study. He sat behind his pristine mahogany desk and slid a glossy real estate brochure across the surface. It featured a list of approved luxury condominiums in a safe, quiet Connecticut suburb. He told me to put the money into real estate. He called it a down payment on a respectable, predictable life. He assumed he still held the remote control to my future. I slid the brochure right back to him. I looked him in the eye and told him I was securing a commercial lease to start my own business. The look of sheer condescension on his face is burned into my memory. He called it a guaranteed failure. He told me I lacked the killer instinct required to survive in any market. I walked out of his study with my mother's money and my own quiet ambition. I knew I had a distinct advantage. I had financial independence. You do not just open a bakery in New York City. You go to war with the city itself. I spent weeks pounding the pavement. I bypassed the polished avenues of Manhattan where the rent alone would swallow my entire capital in 3 short months. I focused my search on Brooklyn. Specifically, I targeted a gentrifying neighborhood where the commercial rents were still grounded in some version of reality. I found a corner unit that had been vacant for 2 years. It was a former dry cleaning business. The windows were opaque with years of grime. The air inside smelled of old dust and broken promises. The landlord, an exhausted man who just wanted the keys gone, warned me it needed a total gut renovation. I signed the lease the next morning. I named the space Belinda's Crumb. Capital is a terrifying master. Every single dollar spent on outside contractors was a dollar taken directly away from premium ingredients and operational runway. So I became the contractor. I traded my tailored office clothes for denim work pants and heavy boots. For 4 solid months, my alarm went off at 3 in the morning. I would take the early subway from my cramped apartment to the storefront while the city was still pitch dark. The physical toll was brutal. I spent endless weeks on my hands and knees scraping away layers of yellowed, peeling linoleum with a metal putty knife. My fingernails cracked. My palms developed thick, rough calluses. The sharp, chemical sting of industrial bleach became my permanent perfume. There were countless nights I slept on a deflated air mattress in the freezing back office just to wake up and sign for drywall deliveries at dawn. Meanwhile, my father and brother were closing corporate mergers in climate-controlled glass skyscrapers. Julian was getting fitted for bespoke suits to celebrate his promotion. I was at a restaurant supply liquidator in Queens, haggling over the price of a scratched stainless steel prep table and a refurbished stand mixer. I was exhausted, down to my bones. But for the first time in my entire life, I was the sole architect of my reality. Amidst the drywall dust and the fumes of fresh paint, I had a psychological anchor, a weathered, leather-bound journal wrapped in fraying twine. It belonged to my mother. Inside the fragile yellowed pages were her handwritten recipes. These were not the trendy, overpriced creations you see on viral social media pages. They were Depression-era techniques passed down from her own grandmother. Recipes forged in times of scarcity, where the magic came from deep culinary technique rather than expensive shortcuts. The precise temperature required to brown butter until it releases the aroma of toasted hazelnuts. The exact folding method needed to make a tart shell flake into a dozen weightless layers without using excess fat. I remember a distinct morning when I was 16 years old. My father was having our home kitchen redecorated to feature in an upscale architectural magazine. He hired an interior designer to stage the marble counters with glossy, unread cookbooks. I walked in to find him holding my mother's journal over the trash can. He pinched the worn leather cover between his fingers with undisguised disgust. He said it looked cheap. He told me it ruined the pristine aesthetic of the new kitchen. I snatched it out of his hands and hid it under my mattress. He never understood that true value rarely comes in a glossy package. He measured worth by the visible price tag. My mother measured it by substance and endurance. Now that cheap journal was the foundational blueprint of my entire business model. It was an untouchable asset that no competitor could replicate. The physical renovation was only the first grueling battle. As the drywall went up and the heavy commercial ovens were finally wired into the grid, a colder reality set in. The Brooklyn neighborhood was transitioning, but daily foot traffic remained unpredictable. 2 independent coffee shops on the next block had shuttered their doors within 6 months of opening. I sat at my makeshift plywood desk under a single bare light bulb, running my financial projections late into the night. The spreadsheet glowing on my laptop screen was unforgiving. Between the steep security deposit, the endless city permits, the mandatory plumbing upgrades, and the initial bulk inventory order, my mother's money was draining at an alarming rate. I calculated the remaining balance. I had exactly enough operating capital to keep the lights on for 6 months. 6 months to build a loyal customer base. 6 months to turn a verifiable profit. If the bakery bled cash past that rigid deadline, the doors would close forever. The bank would seize the refurbished equipment. The landlord would change the locks. The most terrifying part was knowing that if I failed, my father would get the one thing he craved more than money. He would get the right to tell his friends he was right all along. He would get to watch me pack up my dreams and ask for a job at his firm. The stakes were no longer just about proving a point. They were about sheer survival. Every morning when I fired up the ovens to test the recipes, I could feel the invisible clock ticking down. I was betting my entire inheritance and my physical health on a collection of handwritten notes and my own 2 hands. I had 0 margin for error. A single bad online review, a broken refrigeration unit, or a slow opening week could send me into a financial death spiral. The grand opening was rapidly approaching. The storefront was finally painted a deep, inviting navy blue. The display cases were polished glass, waiting to be filled with pastries. The espresso machine hissed with fresh steam. I had mailed formal embossed invitations to my father, my stepmother, and my brother. It was a polite olive branch, offering them a chance to step up and support the daughter they had written off. I was standing on the edge of a sheer cliff. The flour was prepped, the butter was browned, the open sign was resting on the counter, ready to be flipped. The stage was perfectly set. The only question left was whether my family would actually show up or leave me to face the firing squad alone. It was 4 a.m. on a Tuesday when I unlocked the front door of Belinda's Crumb for the very first time. The street lamps outside were still humming their electric buzz against the Brooklyn pavement. I tied my canvas apron tight around my waist and turned on the commercial ovens. The familiar, comforting hum of the ventilation system filled the quiet space. Today was the grand opening. I had spent the last 48 hours doing nothing but scaling dough, proofing yeast, and perfecting the precise temperature for my signature brown butter tartlets. The glass display cases gleamed under the warm pendant lights. I had even arranged a small cluster of fresh eucalyptus on the corner table near the window. I printed a crisp white card that read, "Reserved for Family," and placed it right in the center of that table. I smoothed out the edges of the card and stepped back. My brother Julian used to sneak into the kitchen when we were children just to steal the scraps of my pie dough before dinner. He used to sit on the counter and watch me bake. I thought maybe today he would remember that. I mailed formal, embossed invitations to his penthouse and to my father's estate weeks ago. I gave them the time, the address, and the opportunity to stand by me. At 7 o'clock sharp, I flipped the front sign from closed to open. The morning commute began outside my windows. People rushed past the storefront holding umbrellas and briefcases, their heads down against the chilling wind. A few curious locals wandered in, purchased a standard drip coffee and a single croissant, and left in a hurry. The morning rush faded into a quiet lull. I wiped down the espresso machine. I restocked the paper napkins. I kept glancing out the large front window toward the street corner, expecting to see a familiar luxury sedan pull up to the curb. 10 o'clock came and went. The lunch hour arrived. A few more strangers walked through the door to inspect the menu. Still, the corner table remained vacant. The eucalyptus leaves started to look foolish sitting there guarding empty chairs. The pristine white reserved card felt less like a polite gesture and more like a glaring spotlight illuminating my own pathetic hope. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the reality of my isolation crystallized. They were not stuck in traffic. They were not running late from a board meeting. They simply chose not to come. My phone buzzed in my pocket exactly at 2 o'clock. I pulled it out with hands covered in powdered sugar. The screen lit up with a message from my father. I read the words 3 times to ensure I understood the deliberate cruelty woven into every syllable. Too busy moving real capital today. Hope you sell a few cupcakes. Call me when you need a bailout. He did not even have the decency to call. He reduced 12 months of my blood, sweat, and financial risk into a patronizing joke. A sharp, cold knot tightened in my chest. I looked over at the display case holding 75 unsold brown butter tartlets, representing hundreds of dollars in raw premium ingredients. I walked out from behind the counter, marched straight over to the corner window table, picked up the reserved sign, and dropped it directly into the trash bin. I did not shed a single tear. The family I kept waiting for was never going to arrive. Seeking their reconciliation was a dead end. That realization was a bitter pill, but it cured me of my lingering childhood delusions forever. The grief vanished, replaced instantly by a calculating survival instinct. I could not sit behind a counter waiting for the world to discover me while my startup capital bled dry. If the market was not coming to my pastry case, I would take the pastry case to the market. I grabbed 6 flat bakery boxes and loaded them with my best inventory. I packed the brown butter tartlets, the sea salt chocolate brioche, and the caramelized onion galettes. I locked the front door of my shop right in the middle of the afternoon. I walked 3 blocks down the avenue to a high-end independent coffee roaster I had scoped out months prior. The barista behind their counter looked cynical. He wore a dark beanie and sported tattoos down both arms. He looked like a man who had tasted every mediocre baked good in the tri-state area and hated all of them. I placed a sleek white box on his counter and flipped the lid open. I introduced myself as his new neighbor and offered him a tartlet on the house. He eyed the pastry with deep suspicion. He picked it up, examining the flaky layers of the shell before taking a hesitant bite. I watched his expression shift from bored apathy to stunned silence. The rich, nutty profile of the browned butter hit his palate, followed by the delicate crunch of the pastry crust. He swallowed, looked at the box, and asked how many of those I had left in my shop. I told him I had 4 dozen. He pulled out his wallet and bought half my display case right there on the spot. He promised to hand them out to his regular premium clients. I repeated that unyielding grassroots hustle at a local boutique law firm, a neighborhood floral studio, and an independent bookstore. I forced the neighborhood to taste my product. By 6 o'clock that evening, I walked back into Belinda's Crumb with empty boxes and a pocket full of cash. I had salvaged the opening day not through family support, but through sheer, relentless grit. That decisive pivot saved my business, but it set a grueling, unforgiving pace. For the next 3 months, my life was a relentless blur of flour and exhaustion. I was the executive chef, the marketing director, the dishwasher, and the accountant. My hands were permanently scarred from hot baking sheets. My spine ached from standing 14 hours a day. The foot traffic steadily increased thanks to word of mouth from that cynical barista and the other local merchants. The neighborhood started to recognize my brand. The revenue kept the lights on and paid the landlord, but I was barely breaking even. I was surviving on razor-thin margins, praying that my industrial mixer would not break down because I had 0 emergency funds left to repair it. My father's prediction of bankruptcy still hung over my head like a sharp blade waiting to drop. I needed a catalyst. I needed a miracle to break out of the survival loop and prove the financial viability of my mother's recipes. Then came a gloomy, rain-soaked Tuesday morning marking my 3rd month in business. The street outside was quiet. The sky was a heavy slate gray. I was dusting a fresh batch of brioche when the heavy roar of a powerful engine broke the silence. I looked out the front window. A sleek black luxury SUV with tinted windows pulled up directly to the curb outside my storefront. The vehicle idled for a long moment. Then 4 doors opened in unison. 6 months of relentless labor had transformed my physical reality into a blur of toasted flour and sleep deprivation. The calendar flipped to early November. A bitter, relentless storm battered the Brooklyn pavement on a quiet Tuesday morning. Rainwater rushed along the concrete curbs, carrying fallen autumn leaves toward the overflowing storm drains. The brass bell above my front door remained painfully silent. I stood behind the polished glass display case, wiping the surface for the 4th consecutive time. My bank account balance hovered precariously close to the zero marker. The sweet, comforting aroma of caramelized sugar and roasted pecans filled the warm air inside the shop, masking the sharp, metallic taste of financial anxiety building in my throat. Surviving was not the same thing as thriving. My father had given my business a 12-month expiration date. Half of that timeline had already evaporated. I needed a catalyst. Suddenly, a sleek, black luxury vehicle parked illegally on the wet street directly outside my storefront. The heavy doors swung open in unison. A chaotic swarm of individuals poured onto the sidewalk, carrying bulky television cameras, long boom microphones, and harsh lighting rigs. They pushed through my entrance without asking for permission. Bright white LED panels instantly flooded my humble bakery, chasing away the cozy amber shadows I had carefully curated. A frantic producer, holding a digital tablet, started directing the camera operators, rapidly turning my quiet dining area into a chaotic, makeshift broadcast studio. Cables snaked across the floor tiles, lenses focused on my pastry racks. Then the man himself walked through the door. It was Gordon, the notoriously exacting culinary titan famous for dismantling amateur cooks on international television. He wore a crisp, dark-tailored shirt and carried an intimidating, restless energy that commanded the room. He was currently filming a highly anticipated network series dedicated to uncovering hidden culinary gems tucked away in overlooked city boroughs. My cynical barista friend from down the street had apparently submitted an anonymous tip to the production company. I stood frozen behind the counter. A stainless steel whisk slipped from my trembling fingers. It crashed against the ceramic floor tiles. The metallic clatter echoed loudly under the sensitive audio equipment. Gordon snapped his attention toward the sudden noise. His piercing blue eyes locked onto me. A surge of visceral panic flooded my veins. I quickly kicked the fallen tool under the wooden prep station and wiped my sweating palms on my canvas apron. He marched directly to the glass display. He did not smile. He inspected my morning inventory with the surgical precision of a diamond appraiser looking for a fatal flaw. "I will take the signature brown butter tartlet," he instructed. His British accent was clipped and authoritative. I grabbed a pair of silver serving tongs. My fingers shook so severely I nearly dropped the delicate pastry. I gently placed the dessert onto a simple white porcelain plate and slid it across the cold marble counter. 5 different high-definition camera lenses immediately zoomed in on the small circular creation. The entire bakery fell dead silent. Even the bustling film crew stopped breathing, anticipating a signature verbal explosion. Gordon picked up a small pastry fork. He pressed the silver tines into the outer crust. The baked dough fractured with a perfect audible crunch, revealing the intricate, weightless layers hidden within. He lifted a generous piece to his mouth. He chewed slowly, his brow furrowed deep in concentration. He closed his eyes. The seconds stretched into an excruciating eternity. I braced my posture for a blistering critique. I prepared to hear him tear apart my family legacy on national television. Gordon opened his eyes. He set the fork down carefully on the ceramic plate. "Absolute world-class perfection," he declared. The production crew exhaled a collective breath of relief. He pointed a finger at the remaining golden crumbs. "The flavor profile happening here is extraordinary. The hazelnut notes radiating from the browned butter are achieved at the exact fraction of a second before the milk solids burn. The flakiness of this shell requires a chilling technique most veteran Parisian chefs fail to master. Who is the executive pastry chef in this building? I need to meet the seasoned genius running this kitchen. I swallowed the heavy lump forming in my throat. I cleared my voice to speak. It is just me, I replied. I am the sole owner, the baker, the recipe developer, and the janitor. Gordon stared at me in genuine disbelief. He looked around the tiny, cramped prep space, noting the refurbished stand mixer, the scuffed walls, and the solitary oven. You produce this level of elite gastronomy inside this tiny shoebox? He asked. I nodded slowly. My mother wrote that specific recipe during the Depression, I explained. I just followed her handwritten instructions. His harsh, demanding demeanor softened into an expression of pure professional respect. He spent the next full hour interviewing me on camera. He praised the integrity, the unyielding grit, and the fierce quality of my daily grind. The very passion my father had openly mocked was now receiving profound validation from the highest culinary authority on television. As the crew began packing their expensive gear into waterproof cases, the producer handed me a thick stack of legal documents. It was a strict non-disclosure agreement. The segment they just filmed was spectacular, but it belonged to a highly anticipated season finale. The episode would not air on the network for another 3 long months. Until the broadcast premiered in late February, I was legally forbidden from telling a single soul about the visit. I could not post the news on social media. I could not use his famous name for local advertising. I had to remain entirely invisible just a little while longer. I signed the paperwork without hesitation. 2 weeks later, the Thanksgiving holiday arrived. I received a formal, rigid invitation to dine at the Connecticut estate. Against my better judgment, I decided to attend. I wore a simple, modest sweater and drove my reliable used sedan up the long, winding gravel driveway. Inside the grand dining room, crystal wine glasses sparkled brilliantly under the immense chandelier. My brother Julian sat across the table wearing an expensive cashmere turtleneck, loudly boasting about his latest corporate acquisition and his climbing stock portfolio. My stepmother Victoria complained to the guests about the sheer difficulty of finding reliable catering staff for her upcoming winter charity gala. My father sat at the head of the long oak table, carving the massive roasted turkey. He paused his slicing and looked down the table at me with an expression of performative, patronizing pity. "How is the little muffin hobby holding up in the city, Selena?" He asked the question loud enough for the visiting extended relatives to hear. I assume the harsh winter months are tough on amateur retail spaces. If you need me to review your inevitable bankruptcy filings, Julian can handle the legal paperwork for you, pro bono. We are always here to help you clean up your predictable financial messes. The visiting relatives exchanged uncomfortable, patronizing glances. 6 months prior, those exact words would have crushed my spirit. They would have sent me fleeing into the freezing night, feeling small and worthless. But sitting there, chewing my roasted vegetables, I felt an impenetrable steel armor wrapping around my mind. I thought about the signed non-disclosure agreement safely locked inside my desk drawer back in Brooklyn. I thought about the primetime television premiere, scheduled to broadcast my face to millions of eager culinary viewers. I looked directly into my father's smug, arrogant eyes. I smiled a calm, chilling smile. "The bakery is doing fine," I answered smoothly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water. "I am learning a lot about how the real world operates." My father chuckled, dismissing my quiet answer as the naive optimism of a failing child. He went back to carving the meat, entirely confident in his perceived superiority. He enjoyed looking down on me from his corporate throne. He relished his position at the top of the family hierarchy. He had no idea a media earthquake was currently gathering tremendous force just over the horizon, preparing to crash directly into his pristine, sheltered reality. And when that wave finally hit the shore, it would drag his fragile ego out into the deep, unforgiving ocean. The end of February finally arrived, bringing with it the long-awaited season finale of Gordon's television series. I closed the bakery early that Tuesday evening. I went back to my cramped apartment, sat on the edge of my faded sofa, and turned on the television. I did not invite any friends over to watch the broadcast. I did not host a viewing party. I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, clutching a throw pillow, watching the screen with a mixture of profound terror and quiet hope. The episode was titled The Borough's Best Kept Secrets. When the segment featuring Belinda's crumb aired, the production quality was breathtaking. The high-definition cameras captured the precise, flaky layers of my tart shells in loving slow motion. The audio engineers isolated the crisp, satisfying crunch of Gordon's pastry fork breaking the crust. The editing perfectly highlighted the rich, golden hue of the browned butter. Then Gordon spoke directly into the lens. He looked dead serious. He called my technique flawless. He declared my tiny Brooklyn shop an absolute mandatory destination for anyone serious about elite gastronomy. He said the executive pastry chef possessed the kind of raw, unteachable talent that defines a generation. The broadcast ended. The credits rolled. For 3 seconds, the apartment was perfectly silent. Then my phone vibrated. Then it chimed. Then it began emitting a continuous, uninterrupted hum of notifications. Picture this. Imagine holding a device that is suddenly receiving hundreds of emails, direct messages, and website order confirmations every single minute. The screen of my phone was an unreadable blur of cascading alerts. My website analytics dashboard spiked from a modest 30 daily visitors to over 40,000 concurrent users in the span of 10 minutes. Then the server overloaded and completely crashed. My business email inbox reached maximum capacity before midnight. The local news stations were already leaving frantic voicemails requesting morning interviews. The quiet, invisible existence I had carefully maintained for the past 9 months was instantly, violently obliterated. I was viral. I was a sensation. I was exactly the kind of success my father had confidently assured everyone I could never be. Over in Connecticut, a very different scene was unfolding at the Fairfield Country Club. It was a typical Tuesday evening for the elite circle my father ran with. The Mahogany Bar was crowded with wealthy investors, senior partners, and real estate developers enjoying premium scotch after a round of indoor golf. Large flat-screen televisions hung above the polished bar, usually tuned to financial news networks or sports. That night, by sheer coincidence, or perhaps divine intervention, the bartender had switched the channel to Gordon's highly anticipated season finale. The men sitting beside my father revered Gordon. In their cutthroat corporate world, they respected unapologetic perfectionism and ruthless authority. They admired the chef's demanding standards. So when the screen showed Gordon standing inside a tiny bakery, praising an unknown chef, the bar fell quiet. The men watched the segment with genuine interest. Then the camera cut to a close-up of my face. The text across the bottom of the screen read, Selena Belinda, executive chef and owner. A heavy, stunned silence settled over my father's corner of the bar. These were the exact same men who had stood in the grand ballroom 6 months prior, laughing out loud when my father called my bakery a foolish little muffin shop. They were the men who had listened to his endless, arrogant predictions about my impending bankruptcy. Now they were watching the most respected culinary authority on television call me a generational talent. A senior managing partner from a rival investment firm turned to my father. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch. "Is that your daughter?" he asked. His voice was laced with a mixture of shock and newly minted respect. "Harrison, is that the girl you said was failing in the city?" My father was a man who navigated high-stakes corporate takeovers for a living. He understood the mechanics of perception better than anyone. He realized in a fraction of a second that the narrative he had carefully constructed was collapsing in front of his peers. He was about to be exposed as a fool who had publicly bet against a massive winning asset. In the ruthless hierarchy of his social circle, looking foolish was a terminal offense. He could not allow his reputation to suffer that blow. He needed to spin the situation immediately. He needed to reclaim control of the narrative. Trapped in the prison of his own monumental ego, my father panicked and executed the most audacious lie of his entire career. He set his drink down on the mahogany bar. He smiled that familiar, calculating corporate smile. He let out a deep, booming laugh that commanded the attention of everyone nearby. "Of course it is Selena," he announced, projecting absolute confidence. "You gentlemen honestly believed I would let a member of my own family flounder without a safety net." He looked around the circle of wealthy men, leaning in close as if sharing an exclusive insider secret. The struggling bakery narrative was a calculated public relations strategy. We needed the underdog story to build grassroots authenticity before the media push. Do you really think a 28-year-old girl secured a commercial lease and funded a startup in that neighborhood without significant institutional backing? I am the silent mastermind behind Belinda's Crumb. I am the primary investor. I provided the initial capital, I secured the lease, and I orchestrated the media strategy. The lie was seamless. It was delivered with the terrifying conviction of a man who genuinely believed he owned every success adjacent to his name. The men at the bar swallowed the deception whole. The skepticism vanished, instantly replaced by greedy admiration. They clapped my father on the shoulder. They praised his ruthless long-term vision. They called him a strategic genius. Within 10 minutes, the dynamic shifted from casual congratulations to aggressive networking. The golf buddies who had previously ignored my existence were now practically begging my father for priority reservations at the bakery. More importantly, they were aggressively pitching investment opportunities for the inevitable national franchise expansion they assumed he was currently structuring. My father basked in the unearned glory. He absorbed the praise, the respect, and the sudden influx of social capital, building a massive, fraudulent empire and the foundation of my exhausted labor. I woke up at 3 a.m. the next day to prepare for the onslaught. When I arrived at the bakery, a line of eager customers was already stretching around the entire city block. The sheer volume of demand was staggering. I sold out of my entire 3-day inventory in exactly 2 hours. The cynical local barista came over during his break, took one look at the chaotic line, and gave me a silent nod of deep respect. I was operating on pure adrenaline, running back and forth between the ovens and the register, trying to manage the explosive success. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text message from a former college roommate who now worked in corporate communications. The message contained a single link to a professional networking site with the caption, "Have you seen what your firm is posting?" I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron and tapped the link. The page loaded to display the official corporate profile for my father's investment firm. There, sitting at the very top of their feed, was a polished, professionally designed graphic featuring the logo of Belinda's Crumb alongside the logo of my father's firm. The text of the post was written in sleek corporate jargon. "We are thrilled to congratulate our portfolio company, Belinda's Crumb, on their spectacular national television debut. Proud to be the primary financial architect behind this culinary phenomenon. Strategic vision meets world-class execution." The blood rushed out of my face. My heart hammered against my ribs with a heavy, sickening rhythm. The conflict had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer just about emotional neglect or the painful absence of family support at a grand opening. This was active, deliberate financial fraud. My father was not just lying to his country club friends over drinks. He was officially, formally claiming ownership of my life's work on a public, professional platform. He was using my exhausting 14-hour shifts, my mother's sacred recipes, and my hard-earned reputation to bolster his own flagging corporate standing. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The sheer audacity of the theft was breathtaking. He had abandoned me when I was struggling, mocked my ambitions, and predicted my ruin. Now that the world had validated my worth, he was sweeping in to steal the credit, treating my business like a corporate asset he had successfully acquired. I locked the screen of my phone and shoved it deep into my pocket. The emotional hurt evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He had just lit the fuse for an explosive confrontation, and I was going to make sure the detonation happened entirely on my terms. The morning rush at Belinda's Crumb had evolved into a tightly choreographed marathon. I was no longer just baking to survive. I was feeding a viral phenomenon. The line of customers stretched out the door and around the brick corner before I even turned the open sign around. The air inside the shop was thick with the rich scent of caramelized butter, dark roasted espresso, and sweet yeast. My hands moved with practiced rhythm, boxing pastries, pulling espresso shots, and calling out order numbers. Behind the counter, I was a general, commanding a tiny, flour-covered fortress. But underneath the adrenaline of success, a cold knot of dread remained anchored in my stomach. The image of my father's fraudulent corporate post claiming ownership of my bakery was burned into my memory. I knew a storm was gathering on the horizon. I just did not expect it to walk through my front door on a Thursday morning. The brass bell above the entrance chimed, signaling another arrival. But the energy in the room shifted the moment the heavy glass door swung shut. The organic hum of neighborhood chatter faltered. I looked up from the cash register and saw a stark disruption to my Brooklyn sanctuary. My father strode into the shop, wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that cost more than my entire opening inventory. He looked like a Wall Street shark swimming into a local pond. Walking right beside him was my stepmother Victoria, draped in a pristine white cashmere trench coat. Trailing closely behind them was a young man carrying a professional camera equipped with a blinding flash attachment. Victoria stepped up to the pastry case. She did not bother to greet me. She wrinkled her perfectly powdered nose, waving a manicured hand in front of her face, as if attempting to swat away the warm, organic aroma of my kitchen. She had always despised anything that required actual labor. When she married my father 2 decades ago, her primary objective was cultivating a sterile, curated existence. She traded human connection for country club prestige. Now, she placed her fingertips against the polished glass of my display case, leaving oily smudges right where I had just cleaned. She let out a dramatic sigh, complaining aloud to no one in particular about the overwhelming scent of active yeast clinging to her expensive designer clothes. My father ignored her theatrics. He turned to face the crowded room of waiting customers. He threw his arms open wide, wearing a brilliant, blinding smile. "What a spectacular turnout for our little family venture," he announced. His voice boomed, bouncing off the exposed brick walls. He projected the warm, benevolent energy of a proud patriarch overseeing his dominion. He turned his gaze to me. "Selena, sweetheart, step out from behind the counter. The photographer from the Tri-State Business Journal needs a candid shot of the co-founders for their upcoming cover feature." The sheer audacity of the ambush stole the breath right out of my lungs. He was not just stealing credit online anymore. He was trying to fabricate visual evidence. He wanted to cement his fraudulent narrative in print, using my own bakery as his personal stage. The photographer raised his heavy lens, aiming it directly at my face. The flash fired, blinding me for a split second. I did not freeze. I relied on the muscle memory built from months of solitary labor. I grabbed a clean, damp rag and swiftly stepped out of the camera frame, turning my back to the lens to wipe down the espresso machine. "Come on, Selena," my father coaxed, taking a step toward the counter. He reached his arm out, attempting to physically corral me into the open space beside the cash register. "Stand next to your old man. Let them see the team behind the magic." I expertly ducked under his outstretched arm, sliding a tray of freshly baked brioche into the cooling rack. "I am in the middle of a service rush," I replied, keeping my voice level and my eyes locked on the next customer in line. "I do not have time for pictures." The photographer shifted to his left, trying to find an angle that captured both of our faces. I pivoted sharply to my right, grabbing a stack of paper cups and restocking the dispenser. It was a silent, high-stakes dance. Every time the camera lens tracked my movement, I placed a physical barrier between us. A stack of bakery boxes, the towering commercial coffee grinder, the stainless steel edge of the prep station. I refused to give him the defining image he desperately sought. My father realized the public performance was faltering. The customers in line were watching the awkward exchange with growing discomfort. He dropped his arm. He leaned his upper body over the counter, invading my personal workspace. The booming patriarchal voice vanished, replaced by a harsh, quiet whisper meant only for my ears. "Stop making a scene and stand still," he hissed through gritted teeth, his fake smile remaining frozen on his face for the watching crowd. "You are going to ruin this." My firm is currently courting a premier private equity group. They hold a portfolio in the culinary sector. They saw Gordon rave about this place on television. They love the concept. I told them this bakery was our joint venture. If I secure their capital, it saves my quarter. Play along for 5 minutes, and I will write you a generous check for your trouble. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. This invasion had nothing to do with paternal pride or even his fragile country club ego. He was attempting to monetize my identity to save his own corporate skin. He viewed my 14-hour shifts, my burned hands, and my mother's heirloom recipes as a convenient prop to leverage a lucrative financial deal. He wanted me to smile for a magazine cover so he could pocket millions from investors who believed he was the mastermind. I stopped wiping the counter. I threw the damp rag onto the stainless steel surface. The wet cloth landed with a sharp, definitive slap. I leaned in close to him, matching his lowered volume. "You do not own a single fraction of this business," I said. "You do not own my recipes. You do not own my success. And you certainly do not own me." I straightened my posture and pointed a flour-dusted finger directly toward the heavy glass front door. "Get out of my bakery." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. The fake smile finally slid off my father's face, revealing the cold, calculating predator underneath. He looked at me as if I were a hostile corporate asset rather than his own flesh and blood. Victoria gasped, feigning deep shock at my lack of gratitude. She gathered her cashmere coat tightly around her shoulders and marched toward the exit, signaling to the confused photographer to follow her. My father stood his ground for a few seconds longer, his jaw clenched tightly, his eyes darkened with a quiet, terrifying promise of retribution. "You are making a very foolish mistake, Selena," he warned. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a chilling, steady declaration. "You think because you bake a good tart you are untouchable. You do not understand how the real business world works. The real world devours naive little girls who refuse to cooperate." He turned around and walked out of the shop, the brass bell chiming a cheerful tune that mocked the dark tension lingering in his wake. The adrenaline rush carried me through the rest of the afternoon shift. I served the remaining customers, counted the cash register, and scrubbed the floors with an intensity that left my arms aching. I tried to convince myself that I had won the battle. I had defended my territory and established an unbreakable boundary. But the haunting echo of his final threat refused to leave my mind. He was a man who never accepted defeat. If he could not coerce me into playing the compliant daughter, he would find another way to force my submission. That realization proved horribly accurate just 3 days later. It was late Friday afternoon. The bakery was closed for the day. I was sitting at my small plywood desk in the back office, running my weekly inventory numbers. The delivery bell by the rear alley door rang a sharp, urgent note. I walked through the kitchen and pulled the heavy metal door open. A courier stood on the loading dock, wearing a dark uniform. He held an electronic clipboard in one hand and a stiff cardboard envelope in the other. He asked for my signature to confirm direct delivery. I signed the digital screen with a profound sense of unease. He handed me the priority package and walked away without another word. I stood alone in the dim light of the alleyway, staring down at the thick envelope resting in my hands. The cardboard was pristine, cold, and rigid. I flipped it over to examine the return address printed on the top left corner. The bold black letters spelled out the name of an elite corporate law firm located in the heart of Manhattan. It was the exact firm where my brother Julian had just been named a junior partner. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy, as if it contained a physical weight designed to crush everything I had built. My father had promised to show me how the real business world worked. He was sending his golden child to deliver the lesson. I carried the rigid cardboard envelope inside and locked the heavy metal alley door behind me. The bakery was quiet, the bustling energy of the daytime rush replaced by the low, steady hum of the commercial refrigeration units. I did not turn on the overhead fluorescent lights. I walked over to the main prep station and slid down the stainless steel cabinet, sitting directly on the cold ceramic floor tiles. The only illumination came from the amber digital displays of the convection ovens, casting long, distorted shadows across the kitchen. I rested the package on my knees. The bold return address glared up at me. Julian had recently achieved his lifelong goal of becoming a junior partner at that prestigious Manhattan firm. He spent his entire youth mimicking our father, adopting the same tailored suits, the same practiced corporate smile, and the same transactional view of human relationships. As a child, Julian never played games for fun. He played to establish dominance, constantly twisting the rules to ensure he always maintained the upper hand. Now, he was using his hard-earned legal credentials to draft the rules of my destruction. I pulled the cardboard tab. It tore with a sharp, definitive rip that echoed in the empty kitchen. Inside sat a thick stack of legal-sized paper bound by a severe black clip. The top page featured the words "cease and desist," alongside a formal demand for equity. The dense, intimidating legal jargon was designed to disorient and terrify. It was a weaponized document, drafted by a team of expensive associates whose sole job was to bury the recipient in procedural panic. I forced my breathing to slow. I leaned closer to the amber glow of the oven lights and read the allegations line by line. The first claim was a masterpiece of fabricated jurisprudence. Julian argued that during my sophomore year of college, my father had provided me with a temporary $500 monthly allowance for living expenses. According to the lawsuit, that brief financial stipend was not parental support. Instead, Julian framed it as an unwritten seed capital investment. The document alleged this ancient allowance established a continuing financial partnership between Harrison and myself. Based on this absurd premise, my father was formally demanding a 40% retroactive equity stake in all my current and future business ventures, specifically naming Belinda's Crumb. I read the paragraph twice to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. The sheer audacity of the argument was staggering. My father had cut me off financially the moment I refused to follow his strict career demands. He had openly mocked my lack of capital. Now he was twisting a trivial college stipend into a foundational ownership claim over a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But the second claim in the lawsuit was far worse. It felt like a physical strike to my chest. The legal theory proposed that because my mother developed those specific baking techniques while married to Harrison, using kitchen equipment and raw ingredients presumably purchased with his income, the resulting trade secrets belonged to their joint marital estate. Since she was deceased, Harrison claimed to be the sole rightful owner of the formulas that powered my bakery. The document demanded I immediately cease the commercial use of his proprietary intellectual property or face devastating financial penalties and immediate court injunctions. Sitting there, they always knew exactly how to twist reality until I doubted my own sanity. They were doing it again, but this time, the stakes were not an argument over the dinner table. The stakes were my livelihood, my independence, and the only piece of my mother I had left. I closed my eyes and let the cool air of the kitchen settle my racing pulse. The frightened 10-year-old girl faded away, replaced by the 28-year-old executive chef who had built a viral phenomenon from scratch. I opened my eyes and looked at the paperwork with renewed clarity. This was not a legitimate legal grievance. It was extortion, dressed up in expensive stationery. It was a strategic bullying tactic known as a slap suit, designed to intimidate a target into swift submission. My father understood perfectly well that his arguments were frivolous. He knew a competent judge would likely laugh the marital intellectual property claim right out of a courtroom. But achieving a swift legal victory was never his actual objective. His true strategy was attrition. He possessed virtually unlimited financial resources. He could afford to pay Julian's firm to file endless motions, demands for discovery, and procedural delays. He intended to drag me into a protracted legal trench war. He knew I was a small business owner surviving on retail margins. If I tried to fight him defensively, the mounting hourly fees for my own legal representation would drain my operational capital within months. I would be forced to declare bankruptcy just to pay my lawyers, making his original cruel prediction finally come true. He was giving me an unspoken ultimatum: hand over 40% of the bakery and surrender the recipes, or he would bankrupt me through the justice system. I set the stack of papers down on the tile floor. I stood up and walked over to the stainless steel sink, splashing cold water onto my face. I grabbed a clean towel and dried my hands, staring at my reflection in the polished metal of the commercial refrigerator. Playing defense was a guaranteed death sentence. If I hired a standard defense attorney to answer their ridiculous claims, I was merely playing the game according to Julianne's twisted rules. I needed to fundamentally change the geometry of the battlefield. A profound discrepancy suddenly gnawed at my strategic logic. My father was a senior partner at a premier investment firm. He dealt in 9-figure acquisitions and international asset management. Why would a man of his immense stature risk his professional reputation to orchestrate a hostile takeover of a single pastry shop in Brooklyn? Even with my viral success and skyrocketing revenue, my bakery was a microscopic fraction of the wealth he supposedly managed. The math did not add up. His aggressive desperation revealed a hidden vulnerability. A truly secure titan of industry does not stoop to extorting his own daughter for a 40% stake in a retail bakery. He needed this victory too badly. He needed the equity too fast. I realized I did not just need a lawyer to shield me from his attacks. I needed someone who could dismantle the attacker. I needed to understand the true structural integrity of his empire. If he was willing to weaponize the legal system to steal my assets, I was going to weaponize the truth to expose his liabilities. I pulled my phone from my apron pocket. I did not search for a civil defense litigator. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name of a loyal, regular customer who worked downtown. I sent a concise, direct message requesting the immediate contact information for the most ruthless forensic accountant in the city. I was done waiting for the next blow to land. I was shifting my posture from defensive survivor to offensive strategist, preparing to follow the money straight into the dark heart of my father's pristine facade. The response to my direct message arrived within 10 minutes. It contained a simple address located deep in the financial district and a designated appointment time for the following morning. I left my newly hired assistant baker in charge of the dawn prep shift. I took the early subway into Manhattan and walked into a building that stood in stark contrast to the opulent skyscraper housing my brother Julian. There was no gleaming marble lobby. There were no oil paintings of founding partners intended to project inherited prestige. The office of Marcus favored function over form. The space featured frosted glass doors, exposed concrete ceilings, and a singular, relentless focus on dissecting corporate deceit. Marcus sat behind a pristine white desk. He was a forensic accountant and a seasoned corporate attorney who specialized in dismantling financial illusions. He wore a crisp, tailored shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His demeanor was clinical, sharp, and entirely devoid of the patronizing warmth my father often used to manipulate his clients. I sat in the structured leather chair opposite him and handed over the rigid cardboard envelope containing the cease and desist order, along with the formal demand for equity. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal jargon. He did not blink. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply turned the final page, aligned the edges of the paper with precise care, and looked up at me. "This is not a legitimate legal strategy," Marcus stated. His tone was flat and analytical. "This is a ransom note drafted by a drowning man." He tapped his pen against the marital intellectual property clause. A senior managing partner at a top-tier investment group does not launch a frivolous extortion campaign against a local pastry shop unless his primary revenue streams are evaporating. Predators do not hunt small game unless they are starving. I hired him on the spot. I paid his retaining fee using the fresh capital generated from my viral television appearance. I gave him full authorization to dig into the public filings, the obscure shell companies, and the tangled corporate structures attached to my father. I tasked him with finding the exact source of the bleeding. For the next 72 hours, I returned to the grueling rhythm of my kitchen. The lines outside Belinda's Crumb continued to stretch around the block. The relentless physical labor provided a necessary distraction from the looming shadow of the lawsuit. I baked, I managed my staff, and I waited. The anxiety of the unknown was heavy, but the prospect of finally understanding the true dynamic of my family kept my posture straight. Late Thursday evening, long after the final customer departed and the front door was locked, a sharp knock echoed from the rear alley entrance. I wiped the residual flour from my hands and opened the heavy metal door. Marcus stepped out of the cold Brooklyn night and into the warm amber glow of my bakery. He carried a battered leather briefcase. His expression held the grim satisfaction of a surgeon who had just successfully located a hidden tumor. I guided him toward the large stainless steel prep station in the center of the kitchen. He opened his briefcase and began extracting thick stacks of printed financial records, banking summaries, and corporate flowcharts. He arranged the documents across the cold metal surface, creating a complex map of hidden institutional decay. "Your father is an illusion," Marcus began, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the commercial refrigerators. He spent the last decade projecting the image of a titan, but his foundation is built on toxic debt. Marcus pointed to a dense spreadsheet covered in highlighted columns. 3 years ago, Harrison aggressively over-leveraged his firm to acquire a vast portfolio of commercial real estate. He purchased premium office towers and sprawling corporate parks across the tri-state area. He bet his entire reputation on a permanent commercial boom. But the market shifted. Remove work trends stabilized. Leases expired and were never renewed. Right now, those prestigious skyscrapers are sitting empty. They are generating zero revenue, but the immense monthly loan obligations remain. Your father is hemorrhaging cash. His prestigious investment firm is currently hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. I stared at the paperwork. The flawless, untouchable patriarch who had publicly mocked my lack of capital was secretly presiding over a collapsing empire. The irony was so potent, I could almost taste it. "He is facing imminent foreclosure," Marcus continued, tracing a line connecting my father's firm to a new entity on the flowchart. "The only way Harrison avoids total bankruptcy and potential federal investigations is by securing a colossal bridge loan. He needs an immediate influx of cash to satisfy his creditors. He found a willing lender in a private equity group called Sterling Vanguard. I studied the name on the document. Why would an elite private equity group lend money to a failing real estate firm? Because Harrison lied to them, Marcus explained. Sterling Vanguard is actively looking to diversify their portfolio into high-growth hospitality and culinary brands. When Gordon declared your bakery a world-class destination on national television, your father saw a lifeline. He approached the investors and pitched Belinda's Crumb as his own hidden subsidiary. He used your viral success, your explosive revenue projections, and your spotless brand reputation to sweeten the deal. He promised them a piece of the hottest culinary phenomenon in New York. The missing puzzle piece finally clicked into place. The intrusive visit, the fake magazine photo shoot, the extortion lawsuit drafted by my brother. The private equity group requires verifiable proof of ownership before they release the bridge loan, I realized, speaking the truth out loud. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. Harrison needs that 40% equity stake on paper to prove he controls the asset. He cannot secure the funding without your signature. He is not trying to steal your bakery out of fragile ego or parental pride. He is doing it out of pure, desperate survival. If he does not deliver your company to those investors, his entire world ends. Marcus reached into his briefcase one final time. He pulled out a redacted financial ledger retrieved from a corporate filing database. He slid the heavy document across the stainless steel table until it rested right in front of me. "Look at the margins," Marcus instructed softly. I looked down at the ledger. The pages were saturated in red ink. The negative balances stretched into infinity. The pristine image of my father shattered right there, under the warm glow of the oven lights. The financial genius who had commanded dinner tables and boardrooms for 3 decades was nothing but a hollow fraud living on borrowed time. A sound escaped my throat. It started as a low breath and quickly evolved into a cold, cynical laugh. I laughed at the absurdity of my childhood fears. I laughed at the years I spent feeling inadequate because I could not measure up to his impossible standards. The giant who had cast a terrifying shadow over my entire existence was actually bleeding out, relying on smoke and mirrors to hide his fatal wounds. This revelation flipped the power dynamic instantly. The scales of justice did not just balance, they crashed heavily onto my side. I was no longer the vulnerable target defending my small retail shop. I was holding the kill switch to an entire Wall Street institution. Marcus let my laughter fade before delivering the final critical piece of intelligence. "The execution of the bridge loan is moving fast," he warned, tapping the corner of the ledger. "Harrison is running out of time. He is hosting the senior partners of Sterling Vanguard to finalize the financial transaction. The gathering is scheduled for this coming Sunday." I looked up from the documents. "Where is the meeting taking place?" Marcus closed his briefcase. "The Fairfield Country Club. He booked the private dining room for a celebratory luncheon. He plans to hand them the finalized equity transfer documents your brother drafted. He expects you to surrender under the pressure of the lawsuit before the weekend concludes." A profound sense of destiny washed over me. The Fairfield Country Club, the exact same venue where he had humiliated me in front of 150 guests 6 months ago. The location where he had loudly predicted my bankruptcy and labeled me a foolish failure. He intended to save his fraudulent empire on the very ground where he had tried to destroy my spirit. I gathered the scattered documents from the prep station and stacked them into a neat, symmetrical pile. I did not feel fear. I felt a chilling, absolute clarity. My father had invited the wolves to his table, promising them a feast he did not own. I looked at Marcus. "Draft an affidavit confirming I retain sole proprietary ownership of Belinda's Crumb. Prepare the incorporation papers and the tax filings." Marcus offered a sharp, knowing smile. "What is your strategy?" I walked over to my apron hanging on the wall hook and pulled my keys from the pocket. "I'm going to attend a luncheon in Connecticut," I replied. "It is time to show my father exactly how the real business world works." Sunday morning arrived with a crisp winter chill settling over the city. I did not tie a canvas apron around my waist today. I left the dawn prep shift to my new assistant manager, a highly capable pastry chef I hired 2 weeks prior to handle the crushing daily volume. Today required a vastly different kind of uniform. I stood in front of the full-length mirror inside my small Brooklyn apartment. I wore a tailored charcoal power suit. I purchased it on Fifth Avenue using the very first wave of pure profit generated from the television broadcast. The fabric was heavy Italian wool. The cut was sharp, precise, and unapologetic. It cost $2,000. 6 months ago, spending that sum on clothing would have meant missing commercial rent. Now, it was a calculated investment. It was battle armor. I slipped my feet into black leather pumps, grabbed a sleek, dark portfolio, and walked out the door. I drove my reliable sedan out of the dense city, trading the towering concrete canyons of Manhattan for the winding, tree-lined roads of Connecticut. The transition between these two realms always felt surreal. I grew up navigating these manicured, affluent suburbs, learning the unwritten, rigid rules of elite social circles. Those rules dictated that human worth was inherited, or acquired, through corporate conquest, never earned through manual labor. I spent my youth believing I was inherently defective because I preferred the warm, organic chaos of a kitchen over the sterile environment of a boardroom. I gripped the steering wheel tight, recalling the bitter sting of my last visit to the Fairfield Country Club. My father had used that grand, glittering stage to declare me a ruined investment in front of his peers. Today, I was returning to that exact venue to audit his reality. The entrance to the Fairfield Country Club featured towering wrought iron gates and a pristine cobblestone driveway. It was a fortress of old money and exclusive privileges. The parking attendants, clad in crisp white uniforms, rushed to open vehicle doors for arriving guests. I handed my keys to a young valet. I did not carry a purse. I held only the leather portfolio containing the financial ammunition Marcus had meticulously prepared. Gaining entry was effortless. The front desk staff recognized my face from decades of expensive family memberships. They offered polite, deferential nods, assuming I was arriving to join my father for a standard Sunday brunch service. They did not question my deliberate, unwavering stride past the main dining hall. I knew the layout of this sprawling estate intimately. I bypassed the crowded outdoor patio and navigated the quiet, thick, carpeted corridors leading toward the exclusive private meeting chambers. The heavy carpet eventually gave way to polished hardwood flooring. Each step I took echoed down the narrow, secluded hallway. It was the scent of men who believed they owned the world simply because they possessed the capital to buy it. I reached the solid oak double doors of the executive dining room. I did not knock. I did not wait to be announced. I pushed both brass handles downward and stepped across the threshold. The chamber was bathed in bright, natural sunlight filtering through tall, arched windows. A long, majestic mahogany conference table dominated the center of the space. 7 men sat in high-back leather chairs. 5 of them were senior partners from Sterling Vanguard, the elite private equity group my father desperately needed to secure his survival. They wore immaculate suits and projected an aura of financial scrutiny. At the head of the table stood my father. It displayed the recognizable glowing logo of Belinda's Crumb, alongside inflated revenue projections, supply chain logistics, and proposed national franchise expansion maps. My father held a silver laser pointer. He was speaking with the smooth, practiced cadence of a master salesman. He was in his element, weaving a fictional narrative of culinary conquest and strategic foresight. Our proprietary brown butter formulas are unmatched in the current retail sector, my father boasted to the attentive investors. My strategic rollout plan for the next fiscal year will capture the boutique demographic across 3 major metropolitan hubs. I have positioned this asset for maximum yield. He was selling them my sweat, my burned hands, and my mother's sacred legacy. Julian noticed me first. He was looking away from the projected screen to retrieve a printed financial handout from his briefcase. His eyes locked onto my figure standing just inside the doorway. The transformation was instantaneous. The arrogant, smug confidence melted from his features like wax held to a flame. His face, but my father was a veteran of countless hostile negotiations and corporate wars. He possessed an uncanny, terrifying ability to suppress panic and pivot his strategy on demand. He forced his rigid facial muscles to form a broad, welcoming smile. He chuckled, a deep, warm sound designed to disarm the confused private equity partners who were now turning in their chairs to look at me. "Gentlemen, what an unexpected delight," my father announced, gesturing broadly toward me with open arms. "It seems our star has decided to join the meeting a bit early. Please welcome my daughter Selena. She is the eccentric head baker I told you about. A true artist in the kitchen, though perhaps a bit unfamiliar with executive boardroom etiquette." He expected me to break. He anticipated a screaming match, a tearful emotional outburst, or a dramatic display of righteous indignation. An emotional reaction would serve his purpose perfectly. It would allow him to dismiss me as an unstable, hysterical child. It would validate his false narrative that I was merely an erratic, creative talent who desperately required his steady, logical corporate management to function. He wanted me to throw a tantrum so he could play the patient, benevolent patriarch. I denied him that luxury. I did not raise my voice. The lead investor, a stern, older man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, leaned back in his leather chair. He folded his hands, studying my demeanor with the sharp intuition of a man whose entire career involved spotting liars. I stopped directly across from my father. Only 3 feet of polished wood separated us. His smile remained frozen, but the muscles in his jaw twitched with barely contained fury. I could see a single tiny bead of sweat forming at his left temple. Julian looked like he might be physically sick. I placed my sleek black leather portfolio onto the center of the table. The soft, dull thud of the leather striking the wood silenced the entire room. I unzipped the main compartment. The metallic sound of the zipper echoed loudly in the quiet chamber. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead investor, bypassing my father entirely. I was preparing to introduce the wolves to the undeniable truth. I reached into the dark leather portfolio. I withdrew 5 identical, crisp manila folders. I did not hand one to my father. I did not hand one to my brother. I distributed them directly to the 5 senior partners of Sterling Vanguard. I slid the folders across the polished mahogany surface. The thick paper glided smoothly, stopping directly in front of each executive. The lead investor with the silver hair looked down at the folder. He did not open it immediately. He looked back up at me, his sharp gray eyes studying my unwavering posture. My father tried to intervene. His voice carried a frantic, forced lightness. He took a step forward, raising his hands as if to herd a stray animal back into a pen. "Selena, this is highly inappropriate," Harrison stammered. His pristine facade was fracturing in real time. "We are in the middle of a private financial review. We can discuss your little creative concerns at home. Gentlemen, please excuse my daughter. She handles the baking, but she struggles to grasp the complex structural mechanics of corporate scaling." I ignored his desperate performance. I kept my gaze locked firmly on the lead investor. "Please open the folders," I instructed the executives. My voice was calm, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. The silver-haired man flipped the cover open. The other 4 partners followed his lead. The only sound in the grand room was the rustle of heavy bond paper and the low hum of the digital projector, still displaying my father's fabricated revenue charts on the far wall. "Inside those folders, you will find the verified incorporation documents for Belinda's Crumb," I stated, speaking with clinical precision. "You will also find my federal tax filings for the past 2 quarters, establishing my status as a sole proprietorship. Attached to the back is a sworn legal affidavit drafted by my forensic accountant." I paused, letting the weight of the paperwork settle over the room. "Harrison Belinda owns 0% of my company," I continued. "He holds no equity. He possesses no voting rights. He has 0 legal claim to my operational revenue. Any financial projections he provided you today based on my bakery are fraudulent. He is attempting to secure your capital using an asset he does not control." The air in the executive dining room turned to ice. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. The lead investor picked up the incorporation document. His eyes scanned the pristine pages, absorbing the federal tax identification numbers, the state registry seals, and the unequivocal legal language proving my sole ownership. My father was unraveling. The silver laser pointer trembled in his grip. The small red dot danced erratically across the projected screen, betraying the severe physical tremor in his hand. He dropped the device onto the mahogany table. It clattered loudly against the wood. "She is confused," Harrison blurted out. His voice was rising in pitch, shedding its cultivated baritone. "This is just a temporary family dispute, a minor misunderstanding over seed capital. We are currently finalizing the retroactive equity transfer through my legal team. Julian, tell them. Tell them the paperwork is in motion." Julian sat frozen in his chair. He stared blankly at his laptop screen. He could not speak. He understood the lethal severity of the situation better than anyone else in the room. As a junior partner at a law firm, Julian knew that presenting falsified ownership documents to a private equity group constituted federal wire fraud. "There is no equity transfer," I clarified, slicing through my father's frantic lies. "2 days ago, Harrison realized you required verified proof of ownership to underwrite his bridge loan. Because he did not have it, he hired my brother to draft a frivolous extortion lawsuit against me. They threatened to bankrupt my retail shop in civil court unless I surrendered 40% of my company to him. He is drowning in commercial real estate debt, and he tried to use my business as a life raft to steal your money." The lead investor stopped reading. He slowly closed the manila folder. He placed his hands flat on the polished table. He did not yell. Men who wield genuine structural power never need to raise their voices. The quiet intensity of his reaction was far more devastating than any shouted accusation. He looked at my father. The gaze was devoid of anger. It contained only cold, terminal disgust. "Harrison," the lead investor said, his tone flat and final, "is this true?" My father opened his mouth, but no words emerged. The smooth salesman had vanished. The intimidating patriarch who had cast a terrifying shadow over my entire life was gone. Standing in his place was a pathetic, cornered man. He looked at the projected slide displaying my bakery logo. He looked at the 5 identical folders exposing his deceit. He looked at Julian, silently begging his son to intervene and weave a legal fiction to save them. Julian simply looked down at his shoes. The silence served as a profound confession. The lead investor did not ask another question. He stood up. He picked up his expensive leather briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp metallic click echoed through the grand dining room like the sound of a closing vault. "We are done here," the executive announced. The other 4 partners immediately stood up in unison. They gathered their belongings with swift, practiced efficiency. They did not take the manila folders with them. They left the undeniable proof of my father's fraud sitting right there on the mahogany table. "Wait," my father pleaded. He stepped into the pathway of the departing executives, holding his hands out in a gesture of desperate surrender. "Please, gentlemen, the commercial real estate portfolio still holds long-term residual value. We can restructure the terms. I can offer a higher interest yield on the bridge loan. Do not walk out of this room. Let us renegotiate." The silver-haired investor paused near the heavy oak doors. He looked at my father with the detached pity usually reserved for a dying insect. "Sterling Vanguard does not underwrite fraud," he replied. "Do not ever contact our offices again." The lead partner turned the brass handle and walked out into the carpeted hallway. The 4 junior executives followed him closely, leaving the private dining room without a backward glance. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, sealing the 3 of us inside the quiet chamber. The financial lifeline was severed. The multi-million-dollar bridge loan vanished into thin air. The prestigious investment firm my father had spent 3 decades building was now guaranteed to face foreclosure, liquidation, and potential regulatory investigations by Monday morning. I had just executed a flawless structural demolition without raising my voice or breaking a single law. I stood at the opposite end of the mahogany table, calmly sliding my own copy of the documents back into my black leather portfolio. I zipped the compartment shut. I did not feel a triumphant surge of vindication. I did not feel the joyous thrill of revenge. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief. The heavy, invisible chain that had bound me to this family's toxic expectations was finally broken. My father stood frozen near the digital projector. His bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looked too large for his frame. His shoulders sagged. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He stared at the empty chairs where the private equity partners had been sitting just moments before. He was attempting to process the sudden, catastrophic destruction of his entire reality. Then the shock wore off. The fragile illusion of his superiority crumbled into dust, leaving behind a raw, unfiltered panic. He turned his head slowly. He looked at Julian, the golden child, the junior partner, the son who was supposed to inherit the kingdom. The external threat of the investors walking away was over, but the true fallout was just beginning to materialize inside the room. The collapse of the financial deal acted as a catalyst, igniting a devastating chain reaction that would tear the remaining fabric of this family apart. I watched as my brother slowly closed his laptop, his eyes darting nervously toward the exit, calculating his own desperate path to survival. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the executive dining room. The departure of the private equity partners left behind a suffocating vacuum. The air grew stagnant. The digital projector continued to hum, casting a bright rectangular glow against the far wall. The fabricated revenue charts still illuminated the space, serving as a mocking monument to a ruined scheme. My father remained planted near the head of the mahogany table. His rigid posture dissolved. The tailored lines of his suit seemed to fold inward, unable to support the sudden absence of his authority. He stared at the empty leather chairs. The silence stretched, tight and brittle, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. A side door connecting the dining chamber to a private outdoor terrace swung open. My stepmother stepped into the room. Victoria had been waiting outside, sipping a morning cocktail, anticipating a triumphant celebration. She wore a pristine silk blouse and a multi-tiered pearl necklace. A confident smile rested on her lips, ready to greet the billionaires who were supposed to fund her lavish lifestyle for another decade. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted from the vacant seats to the scattered manila folders I had left behind. She registered the ghostly pallor of her husband's face. The joyful anticipation vanished from her features, instantly replaced by a sharp, calculating confusion. Before Victoria could ask a single question, the brittle silence shattered. The sound originated from the corner of the table. Julia sprang up from his chair. The sudden motion sent the heavy piece of furniture skidding backward across the hardwood floor. My brother grabbed his imported Italian leather briefcase. It was a $5,000 accessory, gifted by our father to celebrate Julian passing the bar exam. It was supposed to symbolize his ascension into the elite corporate ruling class. Julian hurled the briefcase across the room. The expensive leather projectile crashed onto the center of the mahogany table. It slid across the polished wood, colliding hard with the digital projector. The impact knocked the lens out of focus, turning the bright, fabricated financial charts on the wall into a blurry, indecipherable smear of meaningless colors. My brother gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His chest heaved. The meticulous grooming and the practiced smugness were gone. Standing in his place was a terrified young lawyer rapidly calculating his own legal liability. "You told me they would not verify the incorporation documents," Julian shouted. His voice cracked, echoing sharply off the vaulted ceiling. His eyes burned with an intense, panicked fury directed entirely at our father. "You promised me they would execute the bridge loan based on your personal guarantee. You said the lawsuit was just a pressure tactic to make her sign the retroactive equity agreement after the funds cleared." Harrison blinked, struggling to process the sudden mutiny. His golden child, the loyal heir who had spent 28 years mimicking his every command, was baring his teeth. "Lower your voice," my father demanded. His tone lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded thin and hollow. "We can contain this. I will call the senior partners. I will leverage my offshore assets to construct a secondary collateral package." "Contain this," Julian repeated, his laughter echoing with a hysterical edge. He paced back and forth, dragging his hands through his perfectly styled hair. There is no containing federal wire fraud. You just presented falsified ownership documents to a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. You orchestrated a deliberate extortion campaign using my legal credentials. They are going to notify the Securities and Exchange Commission by noon tomorrow. My firm will disbar me before the sun goes down." Julian pointed a shaking finger at the man he had idolized his entire life. "I am not going to federal prison for your failing real estate bets. Do you hear me? I will not let you drag me down with your sinking ship. If federal investigators knock on my door, I am handing them every single email, every drafted memo, and every text message you sent me. I will tell them you forced me to draft that frivolous lawsuit under extreme professional duress. I will testify that this entire fraudulent scheme was solely your creation. The betrayal was swift and absolute. The myth of their impenetrable family loyalty shattered right in front of my eyes. For decades, my father had cultivated a dynamic where affection was strictly conditional. He rewarded obedience with capital and punished independence with exile. He taught his son to value self-preservation and profit above all human connection. He had engineered the perfect corporate soldier. Now that same soldier was executing his programming flawlessly, severing the toxic asset to save his own career. Harrison stepped back as if he had been physically struck. The color drained entirely from his face. He reached out and gripped the back of his chair for support. "You would turn against your own blood," he whispered, the realization of his total isolation finally sinking in. Victoria gasped. The reality of the situation crashed down upon her shoulders. She did not rush to comfort her husband. She did not offer words of solidarity. Her reaction was purely self-centered. She understood the brutal arithmetic of their social circle. A federal fraud investigation meant frozen assets, public scandal, and immediate expulsion from the country club. The pristine, curated existence she had traded her soul to achieve was evaporating. She dropped her crystal glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending shards flying across the room. She raised her manicured hands to her throat, clutching her heavy pearl necklace as if it might strangle her. Tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her flawless makeup. She was not crying for the man standing beside her. She was mourning the loss of her seasonal charity galas, her luxury vacations, and her unchecked social supremacy. I stood near the heavy oak doors, watching the chaos unfold. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults or demand apologies. I had simply introduced the truth into the room, and the truth acted as a corrosive acid, dissolving the fake adhesive that held their lives together. I looked at Julian, hyperventilating as he scrambled to gather his scattered documents. I looked at Victoria, weeping over her ruined reputation. I looked at Harrison, the broken patriarch, staring blankly at the blurry projection on the wall, realizing he had lost his firm, his son, and his dignity in a single hour. They were tearing each other apart. The venom they had spent years directing at me was now turned inward. The extortion lawsuit was dead. Julian would shred every copy the moment he returned to his office to erase his own fingerprints from the crime. I had won the war without throwing a single punch. I adjusted my grip on my black leather portfolio. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family. I pushed the brass handles downward, stepped out into the quiet carpeted hallway, and let the heavy doors swing shut behind me. The drive back to Brooklyn felt different. The crippling anxiety that had gripped my chest for the past week was gone. The crisp autumn air flowing through my car vents felt cleaner. I returned to Belinda's Crumb, tied my canvas apron around my waist, and spent the remainder of the evening prepping dough for the morning rush. The repetitive, rhythmic motion of measuring flour and butter grounded me. I had reclaimed my sanctuary. But the story was not over. The next morning, while I was pulling a fresh batch of caramelized onion galettes from the oven, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller identification displayed the name of my forensic accountant. I wiped my hands on a clean towel and answered the call. Marcus skipped the standard pleasantries. His voice was grim, carrying the weight of a new, disturbing discovery. The extortion threat is neutralized, Marcus confirmed. My contacts inside Sterling Vanguard reported the failed meeting. Harrison is officially locked out of the institutional credit markets. He is finished. I let out a slow breath of relief. Then it is over, I said. No, Marcus replied. His tone darkened, sending a sudden chill down my spine. The bridge loan was not just intended to satisfy his commercial real estate creditors. When the funding collapsed yesterday, a secondary set of hidden ledgers triggered an automatic default notice. I spent the entire night tracing the new data trail. I stopped wiping the stainless steel counter. What did you find? Harrison hid the true depth of his financial ruin even from his own partners, Marcus explained. He leveraged a personal asset to cover his firm's payroll 3 months ago. The debt is toxic. The collectors are not corporate bankers. They operate outside standard regulatory frameworks. Without that private equity cash, Harrison is facing immediate, catastrophic foreclosure on his personal estate. He is going to lose his home by the end of the month. I stared blankly at the glowing amber lights of my commercial ovens. The giant was not just bleeding out in the corporate arena, he was about to lose the very roof over his head. The ultimate symbol of his wealth and superiority was scheduled for the auction block. I thought I had walked away from the wreckage for good, but the universe had orchestrated one final, devastating intersection between his collapse and my rising empire. The true scope of his desperation was about to bring him crawling right to my back door. 2 weeks evaporated into a chaotic blur of skyrocketing sales and endless media requests. The line outside Belinda's Crumb now began forming before dawn. I had officially transitioned from a struggling small business owner into the CEO of a rapidly expanding brand. My bank accounts were flush with capital. The crushing anxiety of daily survival was replaced by the exhilarating challenge of scaling an empire. But while my star was ascending into the stratosphere, my father's world was plunging into a terrifying freefall. The financial press caught wind of the Sterling Vanguard disaster. Rumors of falsified documents and toxic debt spread through the corporate ecosystem like a virulent plague. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally announced an investigation into Harrison's investment firm. Clients panicked. Portfolios were liquidated. The once prestigious Connecticut estate was suddenly crawling with auditors and aggressive creditors. I ignored the news alerts flashing on my phone. I had drawn my boundary. The radioactive fallout of his deceit was no longer my concern. I was focused entirely on the future, drafting blueprints for my second retail location in Manhattan, until a cold Thursday evening shattered that quiet resolution. It was past 10 o'clock. The bakery was closed. I had dismissed my kitchen staff hours ago. I was alone, standing in the center of the quiet prep area, wiping down the long stainless steel counters with a damp, sanitized cloth. The repetitive motion was meditative. The only sound was the soft hum of the commercial refrigerators working in the background. Then, a sharp, hesitant knock echoed from the heavy metal alley door. I stopped wiping the counter. I stared at the reinforced steel. Deliveries never arrived this late. My staff all possessed their own keys. A profound sense of unease curled in my stomach. I walked over to the door, checked the security monitor, and felt my breath catch in my throat. Standing in the dim yellow light of the alleyway was my father. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The man standing on my loading dock was practically unrecognizable. The towering, imposing patriarch who had commanded ballrooms and boardrooms was gone. The bespoke Italian suit he wore was deeply wrinkled, hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk overnight. His silver hair, usually perfectly styled, was disheveled. Deep, dark circles carved hollow shadows beneath his eyes. He looked fragile. He looked old. "Selena," he said, his voice a raspy, brittle whisper, "please, let me come inside." I did not step aside. I stood firmly in the doorway, blocking his access to my sanctuary. The cold autumn wind rushed past him, carrying the scent of damp pavement and desperation. "The bakery is closed, Harrison," I replied. My tone was flat, devoid of the fear or the reverence I used to carry in his presence. He flinched at the sound of his first name. "I know," he stammered, raising his trembling hands in a gesture of pathetic surrender. "I know you have every right to turn me away, but I have nowhere else to go. Julian will not return my calls." Victoria packed her belongings and moved into a hotel suite in the city. "The bank froze my primary accounts this morning. I am completely locked out." The absolute collapse of his entire reality was finally complete. The golden child had severed ties to protect his legal career. The trophy wife had abandoned the sinking ship the moment the luxury evaporated. The man who had spent 3 decades treating his family like a corporate portfolio was now discovering the brutal truth of transactional relationships. When the capital ran dry, the loyalty vanished. I stepped back, leaving the heavy metal door open. I did not invite him in, but I allowed him to cross the threshold. He walked into the warm amber glow of my kitchen. He looked around the space, taking in the gleaming ovens, the towering racks of resting dough, and the undeniable, tangible proof of my massive success. He looked like a starving man staring through the window of a feast he was forbidden to touch. I walked back to the prep station. I picked up my damp cloth and resumed wiping down the stainless steel surface. I did not offer him a chair. I did not offer him a glass of water. I forced him to state his business while I continued to clean my own house. "Why are you here?" I asked, keeping my focus entirely on the rhythmic circular motion of the rag against the metal. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I need a loan, Selena. I need $500,000 by Monday morning." I stopped wiping the counter. I looked up, meeting his desperate, sunken eyes. The sheer audacity of the request was staggering. The man who had sued me for extortion, the man who had tried to steal my company, was now begging for $500,000 to save his own skin. "If I do not wire those funds to a specific private creditor by Monday, they are going to execute a hostile foreclosure on the Connecticut estate," Harrison explained, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "The bank is bad enough, but these private collectors do not operate through standard legal channels. They will seize everything: the house, the cars, the personal assets. I will be out on the street." He took a step closer to the prep station. "I will pay you back with interest," he promised, his voice dripping with an agonizing, pleading sincerity. "I will draft an airtight promissory note. You will have priority lien status. I can rebuild the firm once the federal investigation clears. I just need a bridge to cross this abyss. Please, Selena." I stared at him. This was the ultimate test. For 28 years, my entire psychological framework had been built around securing this man's approval. I had craved his validation. I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn his respect. Now the dynamic was completely inverted. He was the helpless child begging for a lifeline. He was finally offering me the one thing I had always wanted. He was offering to treat me as an equal, a respected peer, a savior. All I had to do was write a check. I had the capital sitting in my corporate accounts. I could easily afford the $500,000 bailout. I could save the family estate. I could play the benevolent, merciful daughter. But the little girl who desperately wanted a loving father had died in that country club ballroom 6 months ago. The woman standing in this kitchen was a CEO who understood the brutal reality of bad investments. Harrison realized his financial logic was not penetrating my cold exterior. He pivoted. He deployed the ultimate emotional weapon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He laid it gently on the stainless steel counter. It was a picture of my mother. "She loved that house," Harrison whispered, his voice cracking with a manufactured sorrow. "She picked out the wallpaper in the foyer. She planted the rose bushes near the south terrace. If they foreclose on the estate, we lose the last physical connection to her memory. You cannot let them take her home, Selena. You just cannot." The manipulation was so blatant, so profoundly toxic, it almost took my breath away. He was weaponizing the memory of a woman he had systematically ignored during their marriage, using her ghost as a shield to protect his own fragile ego. He assumed the photograph would shatter my resolve. He assumed the guilt would force my hand. I looked down at the faded image of my mother, smiling warmly into the camera. I did not touch the photograph. I looked back up at my father. I felt entirely immune to his emotional venom. The armor I had forged during those early, grueling months of physical labor and financial terror was absolutely impenetrable. "You do not care about her roses, Harrison," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the kitchen like a scalpel. "You care about the optics of losing your mansion in front of your country club peers. You are terrified of becoming the punchline to their jokes. You are terrified of becoming me." He recoiled as if I had slapped him. The manufactured sorrow vanished from his eyes, replaced by a raw, naked desperation. "Please," he begged, dropping the pretenses entirely. "I have nothing left." The audience watching this quiet, brutal execution would expect me to simply point toward the heavy metal door and order him out of my bakery. They would expect me to deliver a righteous monologue about boundaries and walk away. That would be a satisfying emotional victory. But I was not interested in a simple emotional victory. I was interested in a structural checkmate. I reached under the prep station. I opened a small, locked drawer and retrieved a crisp manila folder. I set it down on the stainless steel counter, right next to the photograph of my mother. "I am not going to give you a $500,000 loan," I said softly. My father's shoulders slumped. The last spark of hope extinguished in his eyes. He turned his body toward the alley door, preparing to walk back out into the freezing night, a completely broken man. "But I do have something you need to see," I continued, tapping my fingernail against the thick paper folder. He stopped. He turned back around, staring at the folder with a mixture of profound confusion and lingering terror. The last time I had presented a manila folder, it had destroyed his private equity deal and annihilated his firm. "What is that?" he asked, his voice trembling uncontrollably. I flipped the cover open. I did not hand the document to him. I left it resting on the metal surface, forcing him to lean forward and read the bold black text printed across the top of the page. It was time to reveal the final, devastating move I had been keeping hidden in the dark. It was time to show him exactly how deep my new empire actually reached. The silence in the kitchen stretched into a taut, unbreakable wire. The only sound in the entire building was the low, steady hum of the commercial refrigeration units, keeping my inventory chilled for the morning rush. My father stood perfectly still. He stared at the crisp manila folder resting on the stainless steel counter right beside the faded photograph of my mother. He expected a simple rejection. He was fully prepared to endure a righteous speech about emotional boundaries before being thrown out into the cold Brooklyn night. He was ready to walk away a defeated man. He was entirely unprepared to walk away a conquered one. "What is this?" Harrison asked. His voice was a hollow rasp, barely louder than a whisper. His eyes darted nervously between my face and the closed cover of the folder. I did not answer him immediately. I wanted the weight of the moment to settle over him. I wanted him to understand that the dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted long before he ever knocked on my alley door. When the television broadcast aired 3 months ago, my business evolved overnight, I explained calmly. I stopped wiping the counter and tossed the damp rag into a nearby utility sink. Belinda's Crumb ceased to be a simple neighborhood retail operation. It transformed into a high-volume culinary phenomenon. The profit margins on premium baked goods are inherently wide. When you scale those margins to accommodate thousands of daily transactions, the incoming revenue accumulates with astonishing speed. Within 60 days, my corporate accounts were overflowing with liquid capital. Harrison blinked, struggling to comprehend why I was giving him a lesson in basic retail economics while his own financial life was unraveling. I consulted with my forensic accountant, I continued, keeping my tone measured and clinical. Marcus advised me that allowing that volume of cash to sit idle in a standard business checking account was a poor long-term strategy. I needed a sophisticated vehicle to park the wealth. I needed to diversify my portfolio outside the hospitality sector. My father swallowed hard. The mention of portfolio diversification triggered a deep, primal instinct within him. For his entire adult life, he had lectured Julian and me about the supreme importance of acquiring tangible assets. He used to sit at the head of our grand dining table, swirling an expensive glass of wine, loudly declaring that commercial real estate was the only true measure of generational power. He believed that owning the concrete and steel of Manhattan was the ultimate crown a corporate leader could wear. He always insisted that anyone who did not own the ground beneath their feet was merely a tenant in another man's kingdom. "I took your ancient advice, Harrison," I said softly. "I formed a private commercial real estate holding company. I named the entity after the woman in that photograph." I reached out and flipped the cover of the manila folder open. I used my index finger to slide the thick, heavy stock paper across the cold metal surface. The document stopped inches from his trembling hands. "The commercial real estate market is currently enduring a severe historical downturn," I stated, stepping back and crossing my arms over my canvas apron. "Regional banks are holding billions of dollars in toxic commercial mortgages. Property values have plummeted due to chronic vacancies. The banks are desperate to clear their balance sheets. They are quietly offloading distressed asset packages for pennies on the dollar to any private buyer willing to provide immediate liquid cash. I had the cash. 4 weeks ago, I purchased my very first distressed commercial deed from a panicked lender." Harrison looked down at the paper. His hands were shaking so severely he had to grip the edge of the prep station just to keep his balance. He leaned forward, his tired eyes scanning the dense legal text. The document was an official transfer of ownership. It featured the deep blue ink signatures of bank executives, the embossed seal of the city clerk, and the undeniable stamps of a finalized real estate transaction. It was the physical manifestation of supreme leverage. His eyes tracked down to the section listing the address of the acquired property. I watched the exact moment the cognitive dissonance shattered his reality. The blood drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his skin the color of old ash. His jaw dropped slightly. He let out a short, ragged breath that sounded like a physical injury. The address printed on the deed belonged to a premium commercial plaza located in the heart of downtown Manhattan. It was an iconic architectural structure featuring a sweeping glass atrium, private dedicated elevator banks, and panoramic views of the financial district skyline. It was the exact building where Harrison had signed a highly publicized 10-year lease to serve as the global headquarters for his prestigious investment firm. He loved that office. He used to brag about the vast square footage to his wealthy peers at the country club. He viewed his corner suite on the top floor as a fortress of solitude and superiority. It was the throne room from which he judged the rest of the world. Now, the deed to that entire fortress was sitting on a flour-dusted prep table in a Brooklyn bakery. Harrison dragged his eyes further down the page. He needed to see the name of the new title holder. He needed to see the entity that had purchased his landlord's defaulted note and taken profound structural control of the property. He read the name aloud. His voice was broken, stripped of all its former arrogant glory. Selena Belinda. The silence returned to the kitchen, heavier and more suffocating than before. The realization washed over him like a freezing tidal wave. The daughter he had publicly humiliated, the woman he had dismissed as an uneducated amateur, the child he had sued for extortion just weeks prior, was now the sole legal owner of the ground beneath his corporate throne. I did not just beat him in the pastry business. I bypassed his entire legacy and quietly conquered his specific domain. I beat him at his own ruthless game, using the very capital generated by the passion he had openly mocked. He looked up from the document. His eyes met mine. There was no anger left in him. There was only pure, unadulterated horror. The psychological devastation of this revelation was far worse than any federal investigation or frozen bank account. The hierarchy of his universe had been turned entirely upside down. He was no longer the benevolent patriarch deciding my fate. He was a delinquent tenant standing in the kitchen of his new landlord. This was the true subversion of the power dynamic. I had not sought petty revenge. I had not slashed the tires of his luxury car or orchestrated a public screaming match. Those actions would have been driven by emotion, and emotion is fleeting. I had executed a flawless structural acquisition. I had purchased his reality. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but he could not form a coherent sentence. He pointed a trembling finger at the deed, then gestured weakly toward the alley door, trapped in a state of paralyzing shock. He was trying to calculate the implications of my ownership. He knew his investment firm was currently 3 months behind on their exorbitant commercial rent payments. He knew his previous corporate landlord had been threatening eviction before the bank sold the distressed note to my holding company. He suddenly realized the horrific depth of his vulnerability. He had come to my bakery begging for a $500,000 personal loan to save his residential estate, entirely unaware that his professional existence was already resting in the palm of my hand. The air in the room felt charged with a dangerous electric anticipation. Harrison stared at me, his hollow eyes searching my face for any sign of my next move. He was waiting for the hammer to fall. He was expecting me to gloat. He was bracing for a vicious, triumphant monologue where I would use my newly acquired leverage to crush whatever dignity he had left. He assumed I would wield this immense power with the same cruel, transactional malice he had always used against me. I stood calmly under the warm amber glow of the oven lights, watching the man who had tormented my youth tremble in my kitchen. The conflict had shifted from a battle for survival into the ultimate execution of authority. The choice of how to wield that authority now belonged entirely to me. Harrison stared at the commercial property deed resting on the cold stainless steel counter. He was a man who had spent his entire professional career swimming in shark-infested financial waters, so naturally, he expected to be bitten. I could see the frantic, chaotic calculations firing behind his sunken, tired eyes. He was bracing his physical body for a theatrical, brutal execution. In his mind, he assumed I would call the downtown building security team the very next morning. He thought I would revoke his electronic access keycards and order armed guards to toss his custom mahogany desk out onto the busy Manhattan pavement. He anticipated a public spectacle, because a spectacle was exactly what he would have orchestrated if our positions were reversed. In his cutthroat corporate worldview, power was only valuable if it was wielded to inflict maximum visible pain upon an opponent. He stood frozen in my kitchen, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths, waiting for the screaming to begin. He waited for me to hurl decades of pent-up resentment directly at his face. He wanted me to yell at him. Yelling would indicate that I still cared about his opinion. It would mean he still held some fraction of emotional sway over my nervous system. I did not raise my voice. I did not indulge his desperate need for a dramatic emotional climax. I picked up the commercial property deed from the metal counter and carefully slid the thick paper back inside the crisp manila folder. I operated with the serene, focused efficiency of a master pastry chef, measuring exact ingredients for a very delicate dough. I leaned my hip against the prep station and loosely folded my hands. The ambient hum of the commercial refrigerators provided a low, steady soundtrack to his unraveling. During the acquisition audit last month, my accounting team reviewed the internal rent ledgers for the entire downtown commercial plaza. I explained maintaining a steady conversational tone. The process was highly thorough. We examined every single tenant profile and cross-referenced the monthly wire transfers. We discovered that your investment firm has failed to remit lease payments for 3 consecutive billing cycles. You are currently 90 days in arrears. Under the explicit legal terms of your original contract with the previous ownership group, that specific financial default grants the landlord immediate authorization to initiate formal removal proceedings. Harrison opened his mouth perhaps to formulate a desperate legal defense or plead for a fractional extension on his debt. His throat was too dry to produce a coherent sound. He simply swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his wrinkled dress collar. I did not derive any twisted joy from watching him suffer in silence. I actually felt a strange, profound emptiness. The towering, invincible myth of the pristine patriarch was permanently gone, leaving behind nothing but a tired old man who had recklessly gambled away his entire legacy. Commercial tenancy laws in this city are exceedingly streamlined, I continued, ensuring he understood the severe reality of his position. There are no generous grace periods for failing investment groups. If the premises are not vacated by the deadline, city marshals will arrive to physically padlock your glass doors and seize whatever internal assets remain to cover the outstanding balance. I reached into the shallow drawer of my workstation one final time. I retrieved a single sheet of heavy legal stock paper. I placed it on the counter right where the deed had been resting moments ago. I am not going to break the law, Harrison, I stated clearly. I am not going to orchestrate a humiliating public lockout or act vindictively to satisfy a petty childhood grudge. I am simply executing my rights as the legal owner of that commercial property. This document is a standard 30-day notice of eviction. I looked directly into his defeated, hollow eyes. I stripped away the very last familial title that tethered us together. This is not revenge, Harrison, I said, making sure each syllable landed with precise clinical weight. This is just business. You have 30 days to vacate my property. Hearing his given name fall from my lips finalized the psychological severance. It was the ultimate, permanent boundary. I was no longer a vulnerable daughter seeking a bailout or a child craving parental validation. I was an independent corporate entity officially terminating a delinquent tenant. The printed eviction notice sitting on the metal table was not just a legal directive to empty a corner office suite. It was a permanent, irrevocable eviction from my personal life. He looked down at the paper and then back up at my face, realizing the deep chasm between us could never be crossed again. The rigid hierarchy he had spent 30 years enforcing had collapsed entirely. The business transaction was officially concluded. I pushed away from the prep station and walked over to the front of the dark, quiet bakery. The retail display cases were empty, save for a few select items I always held back for morning quality testing. I opened the heavy glass door and retrieved a single, perfect brown butter tart. The crust was flawlessly crimped, displaying the precise golden hue that only comes from exact temperature control. The rich, nutty aroma of toasted flour and caramelized sugar wafted into the cool room. I placed the delicate pastry inside a sturdy, pristine white cardboard box. I folded the cardboard flaps with practiced precision and secured the lid with a piece of dark navy ribbon. This specific pastry was the exact item he had ridiculed in front of 150 elite guests 6 months ago. It was the foolish little muffin that had impressed the most severe culinary critic on television. It was the foundational product that had funded the acquisition of his entire reality. I carried the small package back into the kitchen and held the white box out toward him. A parting gift, I offered smoothly. Harrison stared at the white box as if it were a ticking explosive device. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he slowly reached out and took the package from my steady grasp. His fingers brushed briefly against mine. His skin felt terribly cold and clammy, lacking any vital warmth. He clutched the pastry box and the formal eviction notice tight to his chest, like a fragile, inadequate shield protecting him from a harsh, unforgiving world. He took a clumsy, awkward step backward toward the rear alley door. He did not say thank you for the pastry. He did not say goodbye to his daughter. There were no words left in the English vocabulary capable of altering his impending fate. The man who had always commanded the room with booming authority was reduced to total, mute submission. He turned around and pushed the heavy metal door open, stepping out into the freezing Brooklyn night. The cold wind whipped through the alleyway, carrying away the last remnants of his presence. The door swung shut behind him. The heavy steel deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp, metallic finality. I was alone in my sanctuary once again. The oppressive shadow that had followed me since childhood was permanently banished. I walked back over to the stainless steel sink and washed my hands under the warm running water, scrubbing away the invisible residue of the encounter. I dried my hands on a clean cotton towel and looked around my beautiful, quiet kitchen. The space belonged entirely to me. The recipes belonged to me. The future belonged to me. But the story of my ascent was not yet fully complete. While Harrison marched into the dark to face his imminent ruin, I still had an expanding culinary empire to manage. I still had to prove that my success was not just a brief viral flash, but a sustainable, enduring legacy. The closing of this toxic chapter merely cleared the stage for the true realization of my vision. A year would pass, bringing monumental changes to the landscape of my life and the skyline of the city. The final outcome of this long, grueling war was waiting just over the horizon, ready to deliver a conclusion that nobody in my former social circle could have ever predicted. Exactly 365 days passed since the heavy metal door of my Brooklyn kitchen clicked shut, sealing my father out of my life forever. A single year is a peculiar measurement of time. In the grand scope of a human lifespan, 12 months is merely a brief, fleeting chapter. Yet, under the right circumstances, a single year contains enough raw potential to dismantle an obsolete empire and construct a vibrant new dynasty from the rubble. The seasons cycled through their inevitable rhythm. The bitter, freezing winds of winter thawed into a vibrant, humid spring, followed by a sweltering summer and the crisp return of autumn. During that steady progression, the chaotic noise surrounding my family faded into a quiet, permanent silence. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not afford my father the luxury of a dignified exit. Federal investigators dismantled his investment firm with surgical precision. The audit revealed a staggering labyrinth of toxic debt, fabricated revenue projections, and reckless, over-leveraged commercial mortgages. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. His partners ousted him, his creditors stripped him of his remaining dignity. The prestigious Connecticut estate, the sprawling mansion where he had reigned as an untouchable patriarch for decades, was sold at a public foreclosure auction to a foreign tech executive who immediately bulldozed the rose gardens. Harrison did not depart the tri-state area in a blaze of theatrical glory. He exited with a pathetic, muted whimper. Stripped of his capital and his pristine country club reputation, he became a social pariah among the wealthy elite. He relocated to a modest beige stucco condominium in a generic retirement community deep in the arid Arizona desert. He now spends his days playing public golf courses in total anonymity, entirely irrelevant and ignored by the corporate world he once commanded. He is a king without a kingdom, exiled to a quiet purgatory where nobody knows his name or cares about his former prestige. My brother Julian faced his own harsh reckoning. To avoid federal wire fraud charges, he signed a severe consent decree, surrendering his hard-earned junior partnership and agreeing to a lengthy suspension of his legal license. He currently works as a mid-level compliance officer for an obscure insurance provider in the Midwest, answering to managers who care nothing for his expensive tailored suits or his arrogant pedigree. Victoria, ever the calculating survivor, filed for divorce the moment the bank froze their primary checking accounts. She salvaged a fraction of her jewelry collection and moved to a small coastal town, desperate to find another wealthy benefactor to fund her curated illusions. I did not shed a single tear for any of them. I did not monitor their downfalls with gleeful vindication. I simply stopped paying attention. I reclaimed the vast reserves of psychological energy I used to waste seeking their approval, and I poured every single drop of that focus directly into my own vision. Today is a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in late October. I am standing on the bustling corner of a prime cobblestone street in Tribeca. The Manhattan skyline towers above me, gleaming under the pale morning sun. I am not wearing a flower-dusted canvas apron today. I am wearing a stunning, tailored emerald suit. I am standing in front of expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, displaying the sleek, modern interior of my brand-new flagship store. This is the 5th official location of Belinda's Crumb. A vibrant crowd of loyal customers, local merchants, and eager culinary journalists gathers on the wide sidewalk. The joyous, energetic hum of the city surrounds us. The air carries the rich, unmistakable fragrance of roasted pecans, sweet yeast, and my signature, brown butter. My dedicated staff, a team of 30 talented pastry chefs and brilliant retail managers, stands beside me, beaming with genuine pride. I hold a pair of oversized ceremonial brass scissors. I look at the thick navy blue ribbons stretched across the double glass doors. I take a deep breath, close the brass blades, and sever the ribbon. The crowd erupts into bright, enthusiastic applause. The heavy glass doors swing open, welcoming the eager morning rush. The transition from a desperate solo baker fighting for survival in a cramped Brooklyn kitchen to the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar culinary brand is officially complete. I step inside the flagship store, letting the warm, comforting atmosphere wash over me. The interior design is breathtaking. High, exposed brick ceilings contrast beautifully with polished brass fixtures and pristine white marble countertops. The display cases span the entire length of the room, glowing under warm pendant lights, filled with thousands of flawless, flaky pastries ready to be devoured. It is a cathedral dedicated to the art of baking. I walk behind the main register and pause. I look up at the focal point of the entire room. Mounted directly in the center of the main feature wall, illuminated by dedicated museum-quality lighting, rests a custom-built glass shadow box. Inside the protective glass sits a weathered, leather-bound journal wrapped in fraying twine. The edges of the paper are yellowed and fragile. The handwritten ink is fading with age. It is the very same book my father once tried to throw into the trash because he thought it looked cheap. It is my mother's sacred recipe collection. I gaze up at her handwriting, and a profound sense of peace settles over my soul. The ghosts of my past are finally laid to rest. Her quiet, enduring legacy defeated his loud, superficial arrogance. The foundational blueprints she left behind proved stronger than any corporate merger or offshore bank account. I turn around and lean gently against the cool white marble counter, watching the line of happy customers wrap around the interior of my beautiful shop. I want to take this specific moment to step out of the narrative and speak directly to you. If you are listening to this story right now, sitting in your car on a long commute, taking a quiet walk alone, or resting in your room after an exhausting day, I need you to understand something crucial about the nature of true power. We are often taught that success is the ultimate revenge. We are told to grind, to hustle, and to build our empires so we can turn around and shove our victories right into the faces of the people who doubted us. But that is a toxic, exhausting trap. If you spend your life building a fortress just to prove your abusers wrong, you are still letting them dictate your architectural blueprints. You are still allowing their negative voices to control the direction of your destiny. True power does not live in screaming your accomplishments from the rooftops. True power lives in total clinical detachment. It lives in the quiet realization that the people who diminish your worth are doing so because they are terrified of their own inadequacy. My father built a towering aesthetic facade because he lacked genuine internal substance. He demanded blind obedience because he was incapable of earning genuine respect. When you recognize that the narcissists and the bullies in your life are operating from a place of profound, panicked weakness, their harsh words lose their venom. You stop waiting for an apology they are physically incapable of delivering. You stop trying to decipher their cruelty. You simply set an unyielding boundary, lock the door, and walk away. I did not build a multi-million-dollar retail empire to prove my father wrong. I built Belinda's Crumb to prove myself right. I built it because I loved the quiet magic of combining raw flour and butter into something extraordinary. I built it to honor the mother who saw my potential long before I could see it myself. The financial acquisitions, the viral television appearances, and the commercial property deeds were merely the natural byproducts of choosing to invest entirely in my own inherent value. If you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your worth is constantly minimized, ignored, or mocked, I want you to look at my journey and find the courage to sever the cord. You do not need a secret inheritance to start claiming your independence. You just need to stop craving the validation of individuals who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your value is not determined by their flawed measuring stick. Your value is inherent, and it is waiting for you to recognize it. I look around my pristine flagship store one last time. The cash registers chime a steady rhythm. The espresso machines hiss with hot steam. The air is thick with the sweet, undeniable scent of total, undeniable victory. I am Selena Belinda. I am 29 years old. I stepped out from the oppressive shadow of a Wall Street titan and forged my own radiant sun. They looked at my flour-dusted hands and told me I would be bankrupt in a year. Instead, I bought the bank.
The journey of discovering one's place in the world is rarely a straight, untroubled line. Yet for so many of us, the map we are handed by the very people who raised us is drawn with rigid, unyielding borders that leave absolutely no room for the unexpected, beautiful detours of our own authentic passions. When we examine the narrative of a father who coldly dismissed his daughter's bakery as a stupid idea, only to eagerly return with open arms and outstretched hands once the world, and a globally renowned celebrity chef, validated its worth, we are forced to confront a deeply ingrained generational fracture in how we define both success and the foundational meaning of family. This story serves as a stark, uncompromising reminder that imposing a singular, antiquated definition of achievement onto a child does not guide them toward a better life. It merely suffocates their raw potential and alienates their spirit, forcing them to choose between their own happiness and their parents' conditional pride. In a modern society where the avenues to fulfillment, prosperity, and impact are as beautifully diverse as the individuals walking them, clinging to the outdated, rigid holy trinity of doctor, lawyer, engineer is a profound disservice to the boundless creativity and adaptability of the human mind. The young baker in this story did not need a six-figure trust fund, a corporate inheritance, or a predetermined corner office to build something world-class. She needed something far more fundamental, yet tragically absent: the emotional anchor of a parent's unwavering belief. Emotional support, the simple, quiet assurance that someone is fiercely in your corner, even when the storefront is empty, the inventory is spoiling, and the flour is running precariously low, will always eclipse the superficial value of financial backing. Because it is the trust and unconditional encouragement of a family that fuels the deep-seated resilience required to survive those grueling, terrifying early days of chasing any dream. Yet too often, the harsh gavel of judgment arrives long before the harvest, with parents rushing to skepticism and criticism, failing entirely to realize that dreams, much like the delicate, perfectly layered pastries in the story, require immense time, persistent heat, and quiet patience to properly rise. When a parent prematurely judges a child's abilities based on an incomplete snapshot of their struggle, they do not protect the child from the harshness of the world. They simply inflict the first and most devastating wound to their self-confidence. A psychological wound that takes years of silent, agonizing grinding to heal. We must, as a culture, learn to profoundly respect unconventional career choices, recognizing that a mastery of the culinary arts, digital content creation, writing, or any unorthodox creative pursuit holds immense, tangible value in a world that increasingly hungers for authenticity, craftsmanship, and passion over gray, suffocating corporate conformity. But perhaps the most heartbreaking, resonant revelation of this entire narrative is the toxic, isolating reality of conditional love. The crushing realization that a parent might only acknowledge their child's existence when that child is draped in the glittering, undeniable armor of public success. When a father returns only after the applause has started, eager to claim unearned credit for a victory he actively tried to sabotage, it teaches the child a devastating lesson: that their worth is not inherent, but entirely transactional, reducing the sacred, unconditional bond of family to a mere balance sheet of social standing and bragging rights. Family education should never be about shielding children in a suffocating bubble of absolute security, teaching them to cower from risks and cling desperately to the known, predictable paths. Rather, it must be about instilling the fierce, unyielding perseverance needed to face failure, to learn from the ashes of a collapsed attempt, and to have the sheer audacity to stand back up and rebuild. The family home is meant to be a sanctuary, a safe, unshakable harbor where a child can try, stumble, fall flat on their face, and be met with a warm hand to pull them back up, rather than a cold lecture to strike them further down. Because if the very people who brought them into the world do not offer a safe place to fail, the child is left to face the crushing, indifferent pressure of society entirely alone. This narrative is not just a tale of a Brooklyn bakery and a Connecticut boardroom. It is a vivid, haunting mirror reflecting the silent battles fought at dinner tables across the country, urging parents to transition from being the harsh, critical judges of their children's paths to becoming the steadfast, empathetic companions walking beside them, empowering the next generation to hold the pen, write their own stories, and take full, beautiful responsibility for their choices, their risks, and their unconventional triumphs. If you have ever felt the sharp sting of having your deepest dreams belittled by the very people who were supposed to be your loudest, most unwavering cheerleaders, or if you have had to build your own empire in the cold, quiet shadows of their doubt, I invite you to join our community and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories, where we continue to share the raw, unfiltered realities of navigating complex family dynamics, fierce ambition, and the relentless pursuit of a life that is authentically your own. We spend so much of our lives desperately chasing the horizon, hoping that one day the people we leave behind will finally look up and see the brilliant colors we painted in the sky, only to realize that the most profound validation was never waiting for us in their delayed applause. It was quietly sitting within us all along, beating in the chest of the person who survived the storm alone, leaving us to wonder if the longest, most painful journey we ever take is simply the distance between who we were told to be and the quiet, terrifying realization that we are finally enough.